I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome this morning. Glad to see you all here. My name is Katie Kowalczyk, and I work for the City of Minneapolis as a Water Resources Coordinator. I'm the Council Chair for the Environment and Energy Council for CTS. I'd like to welcome today's participants, all of you, to today's webinar, and a little background on the CTS councils. These provide a forum for transportation professionals and researchers to exchange information on current transportation issues and trends. We bring together university faculty and staff with practitioners from the public and private sectors to recommend direction and participate in improving the center's research, education, and engagement programs. At this point, Gina will share the link to council's information in the chat. And today's webinar features a presentation of electrification of the freight system in Minnesota, barriers, opportunities, and multi-criteria planning tool. I'll share more about this in a moment. First, I'd like to turn it over to Mauricio Leon, who's our vice chair and co-facilitating this webinar.
Thank you, Katie. Good morning. My name is Mauricio Leon. I work as a senior researcher for the Metropolitan Council, and I am the vice chair of the Energy and Environment Council with the CTS. And right now we're going to go through some housekeeping items. So first, regarding questions and comments, we're looking forward to audience participation and questions during the Q&A time, which follows the presentations. We encourage you to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen at any time to type comments or questions for the speakers. During the Q&A, you could use the raise hand feature if you prefer. Then we can unmute you to share verbally. Regarding credits, this event meets the continuing education requirements for 1.5 professional development hour credits and 1.5 American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP, certification maintenance credits. The PDH form will be uploaded to the chat for anyone who needs it. Now we're going to go through some spring events. CTS will hold one other transportation research webinar this spring that you might be interested in. The webinar information is listed on the screen. It will be held this Thursday, April 21st, and the topic is on new tools for informed decision in payment management. Please register if you are interested. Additionally, we will be having an all-council meeting in person, if COVID permits, that will be held on May 9 at the University of Minnesota McNamara Alumni Center. The topic will be Bending the Curve, addressing troubling trends in Minnesota traffic facilities. Please register if you're interested. These events are free and anyone is welcome to join. Finally, if there are any students joining today, could you please send a chat to all panelists with your name? We track the number of students who are engaging in our events. Thank you. And back to Katie.
Thanks for that info, Mauricio. Today we have Gina Bass and Rachel Roder on the webinar supporting the event from CTS. And our webinar today is transportation has the largest share of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, and trucks make up a significant portion of that. Most states and local governments have plans to significantly reduce air pollution caused by transportation. The widespread use of electric vehicles is a primary means to achieve that goal. While personal electric vehicles have found their ways to the automobile market and charging infrastructures are becoming more available in urban areas, electric trucks would have a bumpy road to adopt en masse. This is due to lack of charging infrastructure and incentivizing policies, as well as technical and operational challenges confronting the trucking industries. Before the main research presentation, we'll hear from Siri Simons of MnDOT on MnDOT's goals for the research effort and how the research fits into statewide electric vehicle planning and the new federal electric vehicle programs established by the bipartisan infrastructure law. With that, I am pleased to welcome today's speakers. Siri Simons is the Sustainability Program Supervisor at MnDOT's Office of Sustainability and Public Health. And Ali Razi-Khani is the Associate Professor in the Department of Civil Environmental Geoengineering for the University of Minnesota.
Thanks, Katie, and thanks for having me today. I'm happy to share some kind of high-level background on what MnDOT is doing in terms of electric vehicle planning, and then what our research objectives were for this effort. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about transportation and carbon pollution in our state. Katie mentioned this a little bit, but just to dive a bit deeper, transportation is the #1 source of carbon pollution here in Minnesota. It became the leading source in the last couple of years, and this chart provided by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency shows how the transportation sector stacks up against other sectors. And then you can also see that within the sector, there are some key factors that are contributing to emissions. So that would be passenger vehicles and light duty trucks, with heavy duty trucks playing a role as well. In terms of how emissions have trended over the last couple of years, we saw emissions decline about 7% from the transportation sector up until about 2009. And then they've really leveled off, and we've kind of stuck around this 41 million metric tons per year mark. So that's kind of at a high level for context what we're talking about when we're talking about carbon pollution from the transportation sector. And medium and heavy duty vehicles play a role in that. So I had mentioned that passenger vehicles and light duty vehicles are really the leading sources of emissions within the transportation sector. But heavy duty vehicles play a role too. And so just a quick note on terminology in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory from which these charts are sourced. The light duty trucks are anything under 8,500 pounds. So that would be sedans, SUVs, pickups. And then the heavy duty trucks, according to this methodology, which uses moves, is anything over 8,500 pounds. So that would include what we'll be talking about today as medium and heavy duty vehicles. So certainly there's an opportunity here to be reducing emissions from all vehicle classes, including medium and heavy duty vehicles. And the state of Minnesota does have some goals to reduce carbon pollution or greenhouse gas emissions. These are established in the Next Generation Energy Act, and they set a couple of different milestones for reducing emissions over time. So our first milestone was to reduce emissions across all sectors in our state by 15% by 2005. And we got close to that target, but we didn't quite reach it. And we're not on track to meet the next target, which is to reduce emissions 30% from 2005 levels by 2025. And then there's another sort of more aggressive target of 80% reduction in emissions by 2005. So the takeaway here is that Minnesota has these emissions reductions goals, and we're not quite on track to reach them. So as a state and as a state agency, we're exploring how we can implement strategies to try to get closer to that goal. So one of the ways that we started to explore opportunities to get closer to the Next Generation Energy Act goal was what we called the Pathways to Decarbonizing Transportation report. This was a report that MnDOT released back in 2019 in partnership with several other state agencies and a consultant. And it looked at this question of how can we get back on track towards the Next Generation Energy Act goals. So we identified the key sources of emissions from the transportation sector, and then we identified pathways that could get us to reach that 80% reduction goal by 2050. And so that's the chart that you're seeing here. There's a couple different key high-level strategies that came out of that modeling effort for the Pathways report. And electrifying medium and heavy-duty vehicles was a key strategy. So you'll see that on this chart in the sort of medium blue and the dark blue. There was an opportunity to electrify medium and heavy-duty vehicles, understanding that it's not going to be the only strategy that we implement. There's also opportunities to use other fuels like hydrogen to increase the efficiency of our vehicles through fuel standards, which are more so set at the federal level, and then to use other alternative fuels like biofuels. So electrification is not the only solution that we can use to reduce emissions from medium and heavy duty vehicles, but it is a really important solution that we at MnDOT want to explore and understand further. So MnDOT hasn't done a lot of original research in this area. We have really looked to get advice from our Sustainable Transportation Advisory Council, which is a group of external stakeholders from the public, nonprofit, and private sector who are advising us on how to reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And this group directed us to some resources provided by an organization called NACFE, which is the North American Council for Freight Efficiency. And so NACFE has produced some really interesting reports. I'll drop them in the link, or I'll drop links in the chat before we wrap up here so people can explore those if they would like. But NACFE has kind of charted the path towards how electrification in the medium and heavy duty space could play out in the future. And so one of their reports has this phasing of key opportunities to electrify vehicles in the near term. And that includes things like terminal tractors first, medium duty urban delivery vehicles. So this would be like a FedEx or an Amazon that's making short trips in an urban area throughout the day. Then drayage trucks, and then regional haul trailers, and then long haul, because it all really kind of comes back to a couple of key factors like the weight of the vehicle, the existing infrastructure or lack thereof, and then the cost of the transition. So this slide digs a little bit deeper into the thinking in some of the NACFE publications about what this transition could look like. But like I said, medium duty electric trucks would be first. These are trucks that are taking short trips. They're close to their base, they're smaller. And so they're able to overcome some of the challenges that we see related to weight and lack of existing infrastructure. Costs, I think, are still unknown. We're learning a lot as technology evolves, and charging infrastructure will have to improve to make electric transportation more viable, especially outside of those medium duty vehicles. So by 2040, the future may look different. We may see more electric heavy duty vehicles and long haul trucks, but certainly the key opportunity is with those shorter trips and those medium duty vehicles. So a lot more to explore if you're interested in learning about NACFE's thinking on their website. So that's kind of the high level context around this research. And now I want to talk a little bit about what our objectives are for this research at MnDOT. So the key objective of the research was to understand optimal locations for electric vehicle charging infrastructure for medium and heavy duty vehicles in Minnesota. And we think that this research will have many co-benefits. So certainly reducing carbon pollution because we're identifying opportunities to invest in infrastructure that would support electric vehicles. This also could support public health because we're reducing emissions along key corridors in the state, and advance equity as we think about who lives along highways in Minnesota. It's oftentimes people who are lower income and communities of color. And so we think that this general research area really provides an opportunity to advance equity. So those were the key goals of the research. And one thing that we didn't have on our radars when we started this research was the new federal funding for electric vehicles. So this has come out in the last couple of months. There's a new federal program that was authorized under the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is called the bill, or in other cases called the IIJA. And this new program provides funding for states to invest in fast chargers along designated corridors. So Minnesota is slated to receive $68 million. There is a 20% match requirement that we'll have to meet either by getting that funding from the legislature or private partners. And to access the funds, Minnesota has to develop a plan, and that plan is due by August 1st. So that's something that our team is working on at MnDOT, and there's a connection between the plan and the research that Dr. Connie is going to be speaking about. So the plan has to identify investments along key corridors. These are called designated alternative fuel corridors. So in Minnesota, that includes 94 and 35. And we may identify additional corridors as part of the planning process. So the plan will have to be updated every year. In the first year, we're going to focus on light duty vehicle charging, but next year, we're going to be looking at medium and heavy duty electric vehicle charging needs. And so this research will position Minnesota to be able to identify those potential corridors and potential locations for EV chargers based on, I think, a really robust analytical approach to where we might want to identify these investment opportunities. So, like I said, we didn't know about this funding when we started the research, but I think the application of it and the utility of it is very clear through this program. So we're just excited that the timing was right. And I think that's all I've got in terms of background and context. So I will pause here and just see if we have any clarifying questions before we hand it off to Dr. Connie. I'm not hearing any. Mauricio, are you seeing any clarifying questions in the chat?
I'm not seeing clarifying questions, but to remind our audience that they can use the raise hand option to ask any question out loud. If not, we probably can move to Alireza Sakani and have questions at the end.
Okay, thanks, Siri and Mauricio. If I could share my slides, I think, okay, great. Okay, good morning, everyone, and thanks to Siri and other people, and especially Siri for providing a good introduction and background about the problem statement and the research that we are going to work on. I'm happy to present some of the preliminary results from this project and also some findings from another project. So basically, my presentation is going to have 2 parts. Can you see my slides just to make sure?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
sir. Yes, we
Okay,
can see
great.
your slides.
Thanks. So yeah, the first part of my presentation is an overview of barriers and opportunities in adoption of electric trucks. And that part is a very high level review of the problem and the opportunities. And the second part, I'm going to present a decision tool for planning for charging station locations. So the first part of my presentation is actually sponsored by Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee, and a white paper was authored and it should be published very soon, if not published yet. So in that, I'm going to talk about the barriers and opportunities in adoption of electric trucks. So starting with the barriers, we conducted a lot of literature review. We looked at different facts and evidences and other analysis, and we summarize the findings. We don't do any calculation in this part of the research, so any numbers in the first part of my presentation is coming from the existing knowledge out there. So in terms of the barriers, there are 4 categories: the technical performance of electric trucks, operational performance, economic barriers, and utility perspectives. Under technical performance, there are other barriers, infrastructure. We all know that there is not enough infrastructure, basically charging facilities for electric trucks, and it takes a lot of money and time to build those charging infrastructure. So that's one of the barriers for adoption of electric trucks. Driving range, the best electric trucks have a range of around 200 miles, while a typical run of a truck is something around 750 miles a day. And a range of a typical class 7-8 truck is something about 1,400 miles. So we are still far from getting to that practical range of the diesel trucks. Charging time, studies showed that with fast chargers, a class 7 or 8 truck needs something in the order of 1 to 2 hours to get fully charged. With regular chargers, it's going to be something around 14 hours. And with 14 hours charging time, electric trucks may be may not be practical at all, given the other limitations on the driver's duty hours, truck resting hours, etc. Some studies showed that the battery cost of electric trucks can be something in the order of $80,000 up to $170,000, and this is on top of the cost of a truck, a trailer. This is something that creates another barriers for businesses to invest that initial money for purchasing electric trucks. On the operational side, there are charging pattern considerations. For example, overnight charging might work with some of the delivery systems, some of the freight systems, for example, last mile delivery, Amazon trucks, FedEx trucks, etc. It might not work well for long haul trucks, for example. And long haul trucks, medium haul trucks, they may need en route charging. Therefore, we might need to have charging at different parts of the highway network. Loading capacity is another barrier. Batteries make up something about 5,000 pounds of weight on top of the weight of the truck. Therefore, it reduces the loading capacity of the electric trucks. Therefore, electric trucks may be more suitable for lighter weight. For example, for last mile delivery, Amazon trucks, for example, electric trucks may be suitable for that kind of trucks. And repair facilities and technicians. Currently, most of the truck drivers have the knowledge to maintain their trucks, but with electric trucks, the knowledge is not out there yet. There may not be enough facilities, repair facilities, maintenance facilities, and we need to have workforce to have that kind of knowledge to maintain and repair electric trucks. On the economic barriers category, we have initial purchase cost, as I talked about, something about at least $80,000 additional initial cost. And many small businesses and independent operators may not be able to afford that. Beside that initial cost, there is also battery replacement cost. Studies showed that depending on the usage of the trucks, batteries may last something between 3 years to 7 years. So sometime after 3 to 7 years, the batteries need to be replaced completely. And that's an additional cost to the truck owner, to the businesses. And that's another barrier, of course. From the utilities perspective, there are challenges in providing electricity to electric trucks, and there may not be enough capacity in the grid, and adding capacity requires operating costs. Therefore, there's going to be money and time needed to provide that electricity to electric trucks. And the cost of operating the electric grid, the power grid, needs to be paid by someone, and there's an uncertainty in whether that cost will be passed to the trucking industry. So there is this uncertainty about the business model between trucking industry, freight industry, and utility companies that causes more concerns about the adoption of electric trucks. So this slide shows the barriers, and the next slide shows about the opportunities. So there are good opportunities there. A very interesting study by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab that was published last year showed that there is economic benefit in electric trucks. They did a calculation with some assumptions, assuming that the battery price is at the 2020 value, $135 per kilowatt hour of battery, assuming a class 8 operating 300 miles per day. They showed that cost per mile, cost of ownership per mile, is 13% less than the diesel trucks. A diesel truck, on average, costs $1.73 per mile, versus an electric truck costs $1.51 per mile. So that shows the economic benefit of electric trucks if someone is willing and able to pay that initial cost. If the initial cost is paid, that money will be back in 3.2 years. And considering a 15-year life cycle of an electric truck, it returns about 200,000 saving over the life of the electric truck. Therefore, there is this long-term cost of ownership reduction with electric trucks. Considering that the battery price will drop sharply, and assuming that the battery price in 2030 is going to be $60 per kilowatt hour, the cost of ownership reduction will be about 40%. In other words, electric trucks with 2030 price will be 40% less costly to own. There's environmental benefits to electric trucks, of course. The greenhouse gas reduction is another 29 cents saving per mile. That is not considered in the previous calculation, but this is an additional saving if monetized. And of course, lower greenhouse gas emission improves the health and livability of communities, especially vulnerable communities living in urban areas, etc. From the operational perspective, there's benefits from electric trucks. First of all, electric trucks can regenerate electricity, can regenerate energy during congestion, and they may be more agile. They may be able to maneuver more easily in traffic congestion. So the cost of being in congestion is not as great as diesel trucks. Taking more direct routes through urban areas could be another benefit of electric trucks, because they can operate in low emission zoning area. Therefore, they can save miles, they can save energy costs, etc., by taking more direct routes. Studies showed that extended operation time window in urban area is an opportunity about electric trucks. For example, in the late night hours or early morning times, because electric trucks create less noise, they may be able to operate in urban areas and increase the productivity of the electric trucks for the operator. Having said all of these potentials, there needs to be some policies and incentives to support the adoption of electric trucks. The policies and incentives can be categorized under two groups: financial support to offset the initial purchase cost and the energy consumption cost of electric trucks. There needs to be some support from the government to offset the initial cost and energy cost to help businesses move toward adoption of the electric trucks. There could be some promotional policies, for example, routing incentives, low emission zoning to allow electric trucks to operate in urban areas and increase the productivity, extended operation time windows, etc. So with that, I'm going to transition to the next part of the presentation, which is on a multicriterion decision analysis tool for charging station location planning. In this part of the presentation, I'm going to show some of the preliminary findings from the MnDOT sponsored research, the research that Siri and I and other people are working on. The objective of this part of the presentation is to identify the corridors of Minnesota highway network where public charging stations are most needed for electric trucks. And after identifying the corridors, then the next objective is to optimize the locations and type of electric truck charging stations on the Minnesota highway network. So with that goal in mind, we looked at many different criteria that should be taken into consideration when we plan for the charging station locations. We conducted a lot of literature review, we talked to stakeholders and experts, and we came up with this criteria structure. There are 5 groups of criteria, and I'm going to talk about them one by one. Access for e-trucks, basically charging stations should be located where trucks can access to those facilities. And the roads with the greater heavy vehicle AADT are more suitable for that accessibility criteria. Environmental condition, we want to reduce the amount of the footprint of these charging facilities on the environment. Therefore, we consider the land coverage, whether it's a forest or prairie or developed area. These may have different implications for the suitability of the charging locations. Distance to water resources and lakes and rivers, etc. We want to stay away from the bodies of water. And flood risk is, of course, a consideration. We don't want to put the charging stations in flood risk zones. The third column, proximity to other facilities. Of course, it makes sense to have charging stations close to other facilities such as gas stations and truck stations to leverage the existing infrastructure there and create an overlap between the drivers' resting hours and charging time of electric trucks. Therefore, being close to those facilities should be considered as a positive consideration for EV charging stations. Power supply, of course, we want to have charging stations close to the areas where the grid has enough capacity to provide the energy, and if not, the cost of expanding the grid is minimum. Also, we have solar energy consideration. We consider the solar radiations in different parts of the state to see where there is a potential for generating energy from renewable sources. The last column shows the land use, and basically in this part we want to consider where land is available and it's not expensive, so it can be used for charging the stations. So considering these 11 sub-criteria grouped into 5 categories, we did a lot of analysis of the data, and we also conducted an expert survey to see what are the weights of these criteria. So this is a multi-criteria decision making. So different people may have different perspective on which criteria is most important. Therefore, we conducted a survey to estimate the criteria weights based on expert knowledge. And we used a pairwise comparison of the criteria. Basically, we asked people, how important do you think criteria A is compared to criteria B? And then how important is criteria B compared to criteria C? We sent the survey to experts and stakeholders, including the MnDOT staff, ATRI, FMRI, which is the sponsoring UTC co-sponsor of this project, let's say, American Trucking Associations, HDR Consulting, etc. Given the short timeline of the project, we received only 16 responses, and out of the 16 responses, only 11 met the consistency condition. The consistency condition means that if A is more important than B and B is more important than C, therefore A is more important than C. Otherwise, the results may not be consistent. We collected this survey results and calculated the weight of each criteria. The numbers shown here show the weight or the importance of each criteria. They sum up to 1. The greater the number, the more important that criteria is. I want to mention 3 of the criteria that are most important according to the expert responses. The first one is truck volume, the first on the left, 0.36. It has the highest weight, which means that according to the experts and stakeholders, the truck volume on the road is the most important criteria for charging station locations. The second one is, I believe, the grid network by 0.2. Again, the capacity of the grid is the second important criteria according to the experts and stakeholders. And the third one is the proximity to truck stations. The weight is 0.16. These 3 are the most important criteria. However, other criteria have the weights also, although not as high as these 3. We considered all of the criteria according to the weights into an analysis. I'm showing a couple of maps here for the top 3 criteria, for example. We created maps that gives some score to each part of the land in the state of Minnesota. We divided the state into small areas of land or pixels on these images, and each pixel represents a quarter-acre area. And the darker that area is, the more suitable that area is for charging station locations. The map on the left shows the truck traffic volume. We see a lot of dark points along the major corridors. These are the areas where charging stations are more suitable according to the truck volume. The middle map shows truck stations, and those dots on the map are the truck stations, and the areas surrounding the truck stations have darker colors that show the greater potential for electric charging stations. The map on the right shows the power substations on the grid network. And again, the darker area around those power substations have higher potential and suitability for charging stations. About the power substations, we have these dots, the red dots and yellow dots, etc. The red dots are the power substations with greater capacity and redundancy and reliability. And the yellow ones are the second level, etc. So if there are more red dots in an area, it's more suitable for charging stations. And we see a lot of those red dots around the Twin Cities region and along some of the corridors. In some areas of the state, for example, southwest part of the state or northeast, we don't have a lot of power substations. So there is a little lack of grid coverage in those areas. I think I'm going to skip this part because I already talked about that, the power substations, but the capacity reliability of the power substations. And this map shows that we have more of those red dots around the Twin Cities region, but more of yellow dots and blue dots that are lower tiers substations with less capacity, less reliability, for example. And they are more in the other parts of the state. There are other maps that we created. I'm not going to show all of them, but again, a few samples here. From the left, bodies of water. That map shows that we want to stay away from the bodies of water, streams and lakes, etc. The second from the left shows the gas stations. So gas stations are located along the major roads, and they provide a very good coverage of the highway network, and drivers are familiar with those areas, so it's better to have charging stations close to the, or at least in area close to the gas stations. Therefore, we have these points that show gas stations. They are more suitable for charging stations too. The map in the middle shows the solar radiation, and the darker areas shows the areas with the higher solar radiation, greater potential for renewable energy. Then we have DC chargers. These are some of the chargers that exist in the state that may indicate availability of power availability of the energy through the power grid for expansion. And the map on the right shows the flood zone areas. So again, the black areas are more suitable and the white areas are less suitable for charging stations. So we have all of these maps, all of these numbers, and we put together all of these criteria into one map to see how we can combine all of these criteria to consider all of the points of view from the experts and stakeholders. So we created this map that again divides the state of Minnesota into quarter-acre pixels, and a score from 0 to 10 is assigned to each pixel, showing the suitability of that area for a charging station location. The score is calculated based on the GIS analysis of the criteria, the maps that I showed in previous slides, and the criteria weights. For example, when heavy-duty annual daily traffic has the higher weight, so it's a dominant criteria, and therefore we see a lot of darker area along the major corridors in the state. Other criteria are considered too. We see that there are some black points that are found in the map. So for example, if you look at this zoomed area around the Twin Cities region, we see a lot of black dots that are the highest score points on the map, and they are most suitable for the placement of the charging stations. Most of these maps, of course, all of them, or almost all of them, are along the major roads, but if we look more closely, most of them are located at the freeway or highway junctions or intersections. This means that the intersections are a more suitable area for charging stations because they provide access to volumes of trucks on both roads that are intersecting or interchanging. there are so many points that are close to each other, and there are some areas that are not any black points, etc. Therefore, this is just a starting point that shows that what are the potential or candidate areas where charging stations should be considered. And this map doesn't show the optimal location of the charging stations. For example, we see a lot of points around the St. Cloud area, but do we really want to have a charging station at every pixel on this map? No. We want to make sure that we investigate these locations more closely. We find the areas that are more suitable and provide greater access, greater power coverage, etc. At those locations. So by looking at this map, we identified a few corridors that can be considered as top corridors for further investigations. The three interstate freeways, I-35, I-94, and I-90 were brought up as the most or top corridors for electrification. And there are two other highways, US 10 from Cottage Grove to Moorhead and US 169 from Elmore to Grand Rapids. These are the corridors that have higher truck traffic. They have more high score points on the map, and they can be considered for the areas of focus in future studies. So the next step, so I just want to mention again that the identified locations and corridors are candidates only. Further analysis is needed to remove or merge any duplicate points that are brought up on the map and fill the gaps in major freight corridors. There may be some freight corridors that have high freight volume, but because there is not a good grid coverage or there is not other facilities on those corridors, we don't have any points. We probably need to manually insert some points there to have a good continuous coverage of the corridor with electric chargers. So the next step of the project is to develop an optimization model that will consider truck origin destination trips. This is very important because beyond all the analysis that we have conducted so far, we need to consider the origin and destination of the trips. What matters for a truck driver is that there is charging station along their trips, given their origin and destination. If it's a 50-mile trip with electric vehicle, it's very different than if it's a 500-mile trip with electric truck. In the second case, there needs to be some charging station along the trip. Therefore, an optimization model should be developed to consider the truck origin destination trips besides the truck volume, the charging capacity and cost, and the budget and other considerations should be taken into account in the optimization model. And this is something that we will be working on in the rest of the project. So with that, I want to conclude that the adoption of electric trucks will not be easy at the beginning. There needs to be proper government policies and incentives to support the adoption of electric trucks. There are so many barriers, and among those barriers, we studied the planning and optimization of charging stations. The last thing is that the approach that we use for this planning problem is very general. It can be applied to other locations with different sets of the criteria, for example, through communications with MnDOT experts. We got feedback that some other criteria should be considered into the analysis, and we are considering revising the criteria to take into consideration different perspectives. So the approach is general. It can be applied to any problem of similar nature. So with that, I'd like to conclude with acknowledging the sponsors of the project, Freight Mobility Research Institute at Florida Atlantic University, of course, MnDOT, that was the main sponsor of this project, and Minnesota Freight Advisory Committee. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Alireza, and also Siri. Those were great presentations, and I think I will pass it over to Mauricio to facilitate any questions.
All right, thank you both speakers. That was a great presentations. I want to remind our audience that they have two options. They can use the Q&A option on Zoom. They can also raise their hand if they want to speak directly. So we'll give it a second for anyone who wants to ask a question to raise their hand. I don't see any questions yet. And if we don't see any question, I might ask the first question then. So Alireza and Siri, it seems to me that, I mean, we can divide this topic of electric trucks into two discrete categories. One being medium duty, so things like Amazon, delivery, UPS, FedEx, so all those delivery services, maybe some other applications. And then there's heavy duty, which just means longer distances and heavier weights. And it seems like the barriers are significant in the heavy duty heavy duty side. And so I just saw someone raise their hand. So we get to your question soon, Michael. But given this, what do you think should be the next research direction? Should we keep studying heavy duty? It seems there is important technical barriers, or should we maybe emphasize more the potential of, medium duty? What are your thoughts on future research and where should we go from here?
Siri, you want to go ahead or you want me to talk? I guess you can provide a perspective about the importance of this problem, and then I can talk about the research opportunities there. If that's okay.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I think that we can be conducting research and planning and implementing projects at the same time. So I just think about, the goal of the new federal program, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, is to start creating the infrastructure to help accelerate the industry and accelerate adoption of these technologies. So in my mind, we would be, at MnDOT starting to plan for providing infrastructure for those medium duty electric vehicles with federal funds in the near term. And at the same time, working with partners like the University of Minnesota to understand what some of the barriers are. I think there will continue to be barriers in the medium duty space, but then also understanding those barriers in the heavy duty space. And I just don't think it will be a completely linear process, especially with the amount of transformative funding that's coming out at the federal level. So I think you'll sort of see iteration in the space where we're trying out some investments in infrastructure in areas where we think there are opportunities in the near term, and then kind of reflecting on how those work and trying to improve our process so that we're making sure we're making really cost-effective, thoughtful investments that optimize where we're citing this infrastructure so that we can start to support the industry more broadly.
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit to that. Great answer, Siri. But I think from my perspective, the important thing at this stage is that to develop knowledge and create communication and disseminate the knowledge among different stakeholders. On one extreme of the technology or operation, for example, we have last mile delivery or basically delivery trucks, and many of the big companies are probably developing their own charging stations behind the fence, for example, Amazon, FedEx, etc. So there probably needs to be more communication, more coordination with different sectors. On the other extreme, for example, long-haul trucks, for example, trucks that go through multiple states, let's say from Chicago to Seattle, there needs to be communication and coordination of providing charging facilities at different states. Otherwise, if Minnesota provides charging stations, but for example, Wisconsin doesn't, that doesn't work for the long-haul trucks. I think this is the time that there needs to be more conversation, more communication, more knowledge development, and more coordinations. And there are so many research opportunities out there, and we researchers are excited to work on them.
Thank you both for those answers. So we're gonna move to Michael Iacono. So I'm gonna ask Gina if you could please unmute mic for a second.
Yeah, he's unmuted, so he should be able to go ahead.
Okay, so my question was for Alireza, and I wanted to ask about, based on the results of your multi-criteria analysis, you identified a set of 5 candidate corridors where electrification might be deployed. But these corridors seem to run basically the length of those routes from border to border in some cases. It seems more likely that there are going to be segments or portions of those corridors that are more likely to be heavily used by trucks. Is there a way to modify your analysis in order to identify subsets of those corridors where deployment would be more likely?
Yeah, that's a great point, and that slide is actually the most recent slide that I added to my presentation. So it's not really it needs more investigations, I would say. But I did notice that yeah, these corridors are from border to border, but there may be segments of the corridors that have higher truck demand and higher, more facilities. We did not really specify the segments. This is something to be looked at in the next stage of the project. As I mentioned toward the end of the presentation, we are going to look at the truck trips. For example, when you look at I-94 from the Twin Cities to Fargo, there may be much greater truck traffic on the segments up to St. Cloud, for example. There may be so many trips that go from Twin Cities to St. Cloud, and you want to make sure that those trips are covered. And there may be some other trips that go from St. Cloud to Fargo. There are different types of trips. So considering, for example, if MnDOT is going to implement or deploy these charging stations in phases, we want to make sure that we provide the best coverage in phase 1 and then more coverage in phase 2, etc. So this is something to investigate more in the project. Great point, Michael. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have a another question. So I suspect this might be for Alireza. Have you considered the source of truck trips, origin, destination, so OD data for the next phase?
Yeah, great question. Again, kind of similar to the previous one. And this is something that we certainly are working on. Not at this stage, but in the next stage, we are going to do that. We had a little bit of technical difficulty querying the origin destination trips from streetlight data because we are looking at the entire state and the size of the data is huge. And we are going to overcome some of the technical difficulties in getting the data from streetlight and work on that.
Thank you. A question for Siri. What is the balance between the government be responsible for building the fueling infrastructure and how much should be left to the private sector?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in some ways it's been decided at the federal level for us in that these new programs were created in the bipartisan infrastructure law specifically to have government spur the accelerated adoption of electric vehicle technology across sectors. And so we're really committed to making sure that we're able to pass through those federal funds. I think the vision is that the government would not continue to be deeply involved in the space. And so part of that thinking is built into our anticipated program design as we're thinking about deploying electric vehicle chargers with the NEVI fund. We're thinking about working closely with the private sector and having private sector partners install, own, operate, and maintain the infrastructure. So we're really just kind of creating that space for things to take off, but MnDOT isn't actually owning the infrastructure in the long term. So the vision is that at the end of the 5-year period for this new program, there's significant improvements in the space and a lot more electric vehicle chargers on roads in Minnesota, more electric vehicles on the road, and that the government really doesn't have to play as large of a role once everything takes off.
Thank you, Siri. For both, do we have any medium or heavy duty electric freight trucks operating on public roads in Minnesota yet? If so, who's operating these? What routes, number of trucks, lengths of trips, maybe any information you have?
So I can say from my perspective, I think that there are a few registered medium and heavy duty electric vehicles in Minnesota. I am not sure what companies own them. MnDOT does not currently own any medium or heavy duty electric vehicles ourselves. So it's an area that I don't have as much information on. Alireza, do you have any info on who owns the few that are registered in our state?
Unfortunately, I don't have information on that, but I know that there is a lot of development, and the electric trucks are coming. I mean, I noticed that in a conference that I attended recently, there are so many options, and I assume that at least there are prototypes on the roads. But other than that, unfortunately, I don't have any information on those registered e-trucks.
I have to mention here that Metro Transit currently owns 6 electric vehicles, and they're planning to expand and add more. So a question.
That's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Buses are considered as heavy duty
Yeah.
electric vehicles too.
We have a question from David Stark. How are you factoring in future improvement in battery technology, capacity, faster charge time, not just the cost reduction, also recycling batteries? Okay, so let me try to reread this question. So how are you factoring improvements in battery technology? So maybe if you can talk about batteries having better capacity, faster charging. Also, if you want to say something about the recycling of batteries.
I can talk about the battery prices, and I myself haven't done any projection of the battery prices in the future, but I have seen that, and we know that the battery prices are dropping very significantly with the advancement of technology. And in the study that we reviewed by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, they projected that the battery price in 10 years would be almost half of what it is now. And that was considered in the calculation of the cost of ownership of electric trucks. In terms of battery recycling, this is an issue that we need to acknowledge that, even though we use clean energy, for example, from renewable for fueling electric vehicles, the recycling needs to be clean as well. Otherwise, there would be a different type of impact on the environment. I don't remember what was the other thing, but maybe Siri also.
Yeah, I can add 2 points on that. So in terms of recycling of batteries, like you said to Alireza, this is a question that comes up a lot and is something that we really need to be understanding and addressing as electric transportation accelerates. MnDOT did produce a report called the Minnesota EV Assessment, and there's a little section in there that talks about kind of the state of the industry in terms of the materials that are used for batteries, and then some of the advances that are happening related to battery recycling. And so I've got a list of links that I'm going to drop in the chat, and I can add a link to that as well, just in case you would like more information. And then in terms of factoring in future improvements to batteries, when we're talking about the NEVI program, we are trying to future-proof the electric vehicle chargers that we're installing. And so we're installing DC fast chargers. They're going to be 150 kilowatts, so higher power chargers. And then we're also planning to coordinate closely with utilities so that we're installing them in areas where there's enough capacity on the grid to upgrade. That could be for trucks when we start to see more electric trucks on the roads. That could be just to provide a faster charge in general as technology evolves. So future proofing is something that we're certainly thinking about as we're identifying investments with those new federal funds.
Thank you, Siri. I see we have a couple clarifications from and actually comments from Rebecca Place from the MPCA. Rebecca, I will just invite you to speak out loud. So if Gina, could you please unmute Rebecca, please?
Yeah, so I've placed her into the panelist. So
Okay.
Rebecca, you just need to unmute and then you're able to speak.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we have a grant opportunity. I just wanted to let the viewers of today's webinar know about for medium and heavy duty electric on-road and off-road trucks coming this spring from the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency using Volkswagen settlement funds. And it's a large amount of money. I don't know that it's been stated yet how much. And they'll be covering a larger portion of the electric vehicles, which I can't say much about right now because it's not an open opportunity, but it's coming this spring. So stay tuned if you're interested.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lastly, we have a question from Tony Fisher, who says, how much overlap do you anticipate with DCFC for light duty and that for medium or heavy duty? Same size to utilize the same power source and the same charger?
Yeah, we probably both have thoughts on that. Alireza, do you want to go first and talk about how we factor DC fast charger locations into the criteria, or do you want me to talk first from a planning perspective?
You can go ahead.
Okay, so I think we are seeing and hoping for an overlap in terms of DC fast charger locations for light duty vehicles and then the charging needs of medium and heavy duty vehicles. I don't think it will be a 100% overlap. There will probably be locations that are really great for charging passenger vehicles and locations that are more ideal for charging medium and heavy duty vehicles, and then some locations that are optimal for both, especially when we're talking about intersections or exits off of major interstates. So as we are identifying those corridors and locations for EV chargers that are really going to meet light duty vehicle needs as part of the NEVI program, we are keeping in our minds the potential future of needing to upgrade those sites to allow medium and heavy duty vehicles. So for example, one of the things we're thinking about is space. So if we're identifying a space for a DC fast charger, we want it to be able to fit passenger vehicles, but then we also would preferably identify a location that could be expanded for spaces for medium and heavy duty vehicles to charge. And the logistics of that, I think we're still kind of exploring in the planning process, but that's just one way that we're trying to think through how can we make sure we're leveraging these investments in DC fast chargers for passenger vehicles and kind of using them in the future to meet the needs of those larger vehicles.
Yeah, I guess the one quick thing that I want to add is that from the electrical perspective, and we have an electrical engineer in our team. I wish he was here to answer this question. But what I can say is that the DC fast chargers are placed at locations where there was capacity in the grid to provide that electricity. So there can be two perspectives to that when we consider those locations as potential for other chargers for electric trucks. One is that the fact that they are located there could indicate that there is enough capacity in the grid, so there is room for expansion. But another perspective is that they are there and they are using part of the capacity, so there may not be enough room for expansion. So this is something that needs to be very accurately taken into consideration. And the fact that how much residual capacity is at the grid at those locations is the determining factor, I think, beside all other factors like space, etc.
And I would just add from a sort of research and publicly available data perspective, there's a bit of a gap, and it's a really interesting space in the industry right now because we're trying to bridge the transportation sector and the electricity sector. And there's a little bit of information statewide about where our electric utilities are in Minnesota and where the larger power generation facilities are. But when you get down to the site level, there's not as much publicly available data. So I'm just really interested to see how that evolves over time as we're trying to make sure that we're kind of coordinated and that we're using public dollars efficiently. Because I think there's some room to create some really good systems, kind of going back to what you were saying earlier, Ali Reza, about communication and coordination. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to see slightly better utility data over time, and that people who work in the transportation sector have access to that data.
Well, thank you. And not seeing other questions, I'll just hand it back to Katie, who's gonna moderate the round robin.
Great, so this is our chance to hear from you. And Gina posted a few questions in the chat, but I will read them now. Really, we'd just like to know what you're working on and if you have any ideas for issues that we should be considering. The first one is, what current transportation issues related to environment and energy are you or your organization facing? Second one is, do you have any organizational, informational, or event updates to share? And then the third one is, what ideas do you have for potential future council meeting topics or speakers? So again, if you'd like to share, please either raise your hand or you can put items in the chat and we can read them out loud for you.
Hi, Katie, this is Gina. I just wanted to provide a reminder about the CTS All Councils meeting and webinar, which is going to be held on May 9th. It's from 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. We're offering both an in-person and a hybrid option. And the topic is going to be around bending the curve, addressing troubling trends in Minnesota's traffic fatalities. So there will be another e-announcement going out about this later this week with registration information, and we've just encouraged people to attend. The other thing I'll highlight is to mark your calendars for the annual CTS Research Conference, which is scheduled for November 3rd. And fingers crossed, we are planning for an in-person event for the conference.
Thank you, Gina. I think we have Lisa. If we could unmute Lisa.
Great,
Okay,
thank you.
there you go, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentations today. Just wanted to share a quick update. Minnesota Clean Cities Coalition, which is housed in the American Lung Association, we are planning to host a medium and heavy duty demo event in early June. So if anyone is interested in attending that, please send me a note or interest in seeing certain vehicles at this event as well. We have two projects that are in the works with implementing and deploying medium and heavy duty electric vehicles. One is Cool EVs, where we'll be seeing a heavy duty electric refuse truck coming this spring. And then another one is through DOE funding with tribal nations that is just activating now. So we'll be seeing more work, and this presentation again was just great to hear here today. So thank you.
Oh, that sounds like a great opportunity. Thanks, Lisa. I think I have a quick update. Oh, and Siri's putting some additional resources, so make sure you grab those. But in terms of the environment side, we are going into the first year of the new ordinance that affects all linear projects, which were exempt before for stormwater management. So we're going to the first year of having to build these. So we have a lot of lessons learned and information that we've been putting together, guidance documents, things like that for linear projects. I don't see, I don't know, Mauricio or Gina, do you see any other comments in the chat or raised hand?
I don't see any other comments, which means we could probably wrap it up.
Right. We're so efficient today. I'm impressed.
Yes.
Thank you so much to Siri and Alireza for their presentations. It was really informative and, certainly something that we're, at the beginning of. So it was great to hear from you both. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Katie. I was just going to mention that this webinar will be, and the presentations will be posted on the CTS website. So if you have colleagues that weren't able to participate today, they can check out the recording, and it should be available by the end of the week.
Great. Thank you. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.